Hi, I am Sabina Simonson, Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator for the Talbot County Free Library, and you are watching the Talbot County Free Library presents Maryland Blood, an American family in war and peace, the Hambletons of Maryland, 1657 to the present. Our speaker is Martha Frick Symington Sanger. Actually, she's known as Marty. She's an 11th generation descendant of pioneer William Hambleton and a great-granddaughter of Henry Clay Frick. She is the author of 3 acclaimed books about Henry Clay Frick and Helen Clay Frick. Ms. Sanger has been interviewed for the PBS documentary Andrew Carnegie, The Richest Man in the World, and for BBC and Discovery Studios productions. She has given numerous lectures, among them at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the National Trust in London, and the Frick Collection and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A former steward of the National Steeplechase Association and joint master for the Elbridge Harford Hounds, Ms. Sanger compiled and edited the National Steeplechase Association rulebook and raised her Maryland-bred steeplechase champion here and abroad. She has many talents. She also has 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome warmly Marty Sanger.
Sabina is the best. I tell you, she's been on this for, I tell you, months. And so it is really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I really I almost feel that Easton is a second home because I spent so much time here working in the Maryland Room, the Historical Society, and the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, where most of the Eastern Shore Hambleton papers are kept. So I came to know the area very, very well. And so I want to particularly thank people here in the library who've been so helpful. Sabina, a particular thanks to you. Becky Reedy, who runs the Maryland Room, couldn't be with us. She has some family considerations that she had to take care of. But then there were 4 people who helped with the research: Terry Davidson, Ettera, Helen Seymour, David Ireland, Monique Boardley. They dug through old newspapers and just couldn't have been more helpful. And that is what you need as an author, is the depth of the material. And they certainly had that. And then I also want to thank Leon Tillman, who's disappeared, but he set up the cameras and the computer and gave me a quick lesson. So let's hope that it all goes well. The book came about under very odd circumstances. My uncle, who was my cousin in fact, T. Edward Hambleton, was the off-Broadway producer in New York, and he really had a nose for a story. And at age 94, he called me up and said, "Marty, I want you to do a book on the Hambletons." And I said, "No way, I don't know a thing about them, and I never even studied American history." "Well," he said, "you better come up to Broadmead," which was a retirement home, "and I want to show you some things." So out came a tin cake box with archival records that dated back into the mid-1600s. And I thought, oh my goodness. And having done the 3 Frick books, I knew how important archives were. So I said, all right, T, I have to copy everything and archive it, but I'll do the book for you. So I did all of that, returned to his little unit there at Broadmead, and it was all dark. This was 3 months later, and I had the worst feeling. I wanted to drop the papers off, and I couldn't, so I went home, and the phone rang, and T had died.
Aww.
And then, what do? You made a promise, essentially, to a dying man, and so you just hunker down, and you do the book. And so it did take 11 years. It was a huge project. We thought it was going to be a very small dusting up of a pamphlet, but it was a very, very big project. And in the end, we got it done. What I learned through this family is a lot about the cross-section of American history, because these people, this family, was on the forefront. If they didn't invent the new American horizon, they were participating in it. And so what a way to learn American history through the human eyes of one family, through their letters, unbroken chain of letters to the present. And what other that I learned is that these were people who were courageous beyond being courageous. They epitomized the words of John Paul Jones, who said after the Revolution, or during the Revolution, "I do intend to go in harm's way." And that is exactly what the Hambletons did. So I'm thrilled to be here with you, and that gives you just a little idea of the origins of the book. And let's begin at the beginning. This is Old Bartingham, which is right in St. Michael's, just beyond the inn at Perry Cabin. The pioneer Hambleton came first actually to the northern neck of Virginia, where he learned the tobacco trade. He came from Poole, England, and clearly wanted to make money in tobacco, but he was probably also a nonconformist and escaping religious persecution. In any event, he lived with Giles Brent, who was a cousin of the Calverts, but in disfavor with the Calverts, he married their ward, a 14-year-old Indian princess, and then claimed prior right to the whole of Maryland through her. So he and his sisters, who were quite remarkable women, jumped across the Potomac to the northern deck, and there they established a marvelous colony of tobacco farming. In any event, he still knew all the power brokers, and many of them were then on Kent Island. And those people were at the time opening up the eastern shore to settlers. So the pioneer marries a gal called Sarah Watkins. And Sarah was the daughter of a widow, Frances Watkins, who was a Puritan. And she was the second wife of Edward Lloyd of White Plantation. So William right away married into the sort of elite, if you will, society and this sort of a new area of development. Now, Purser Samuel Hambleton, I'm sure you've all here heard of the purser. He is quite a famous guy, and he was 5th generation, and he was born right there in Martingham. In fact, Martingham was in the Hambleton family until 1940, when it was sold out of the family. The purser joined the U.S. Navy in 1806 and was given a commission by Thomas Jefferson. And he was sent down to New Orleans, where he was stationed and handling gunboats. And at the time, Jefferson felt that to have a big navy was wrong. This is still the states' right versus big government stuff. So he had the gunboats to protect all of the inlets and river fronts and various things. Now, if you can understand, a purser does all the buying and selling for all of the midshipmen and for the base. We're talking here 500 or more people that he's taking, that he's tracking what they've bought and what he sold, the percentages of markup. And the reason he was so revered as a purser was that he didn't do what many of them did, which is gouge the men and put the prices up so much that the purser would make all the money and then the men would be in debt to the Navy. So he was highly regarded, and after I think it was 6 years in New Orleans, he said that he would like to be transferred, and that's at about the time that the War of 1812 broke up. And when he asked to be transferred, he said that he didn't like being on the seas. So they sent him up to Newport, Rhode Island. Leon, this is moving. Huh. Seems to be stuck. We seem to be stuck. Ah, can you stay right here? Okay, so they sent him up to Rhode Island. By the way, this is Leon Tillman, and he's the genius behind this. Sent him up to Newport, Rhode Island, to Oliver Hazard Perry, who was then making gunships in Rhode Island Harbor. Purser Samuel was much, much older. He could have been this guy's father, and they developed a real father-son relationship. Well, no sooner did he arrive there than they sent them both up to Erie, Pennsylvania. And you can see the red circle there on the slide, where they were building a big fleet so that they could defeat the British on the lakes and keep the British from coming down into New York, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio River Valley. The purser actually wound up spending only 6 years at sea, so he really did get his wish, although Erie was not a very happy place to be. It was cold and it was a mess, and they were building this fleet from scratch. The first, one of the biggest boats was the USS Lawrence that Perry named after his good friend James Lawrence, who had died. And the purser, Leo, why is it sticking like this? Okay. Okay. Should stay there, should it? All right, so the point is, the big ship was called the USS Lawrence, and it had a deep keel, if that's how you say about the thing that goes down, which was really a problem because there was a sandbar outside the bay, and the British were lurking, and nobody knew how in the world they were going to get over the sandbar. So it turned out that the British Commodore left to go see a girlfriend, and the Americans had built these camels and sunk them underneath these ships and then filled them with water so that they could raise them up and get them over the bar. And it was really quite genius. So they got the two of the biggest ones out and the smaller ones could follow. But Purser Samuel said to Perry, but we need a signal flag for this battle when we take on the British. And how about we use the last words of James Lawrence? And so Perry says, fine idea, and Samuel goes and he has this particular flag, signal flag, made. They don't know if it was blue or black, but it's been conserved and it's at the Naval Academy Museum today. So it came the moment for the fight. And so Perry says, are you ready? And they say, aye, aye, and she'll like, raise the flag, raise the flag. So off they go into battle. And I think you should stay right here with us. Okay. Okay. Suppose I do that when we need to change. Okay. So then the battle takes place. And the problem with this battle was the American ships had short cannons, cannonades, so they had to get in real close to the British, but the British had long guns. And so it was kind of a nightmare, and what was his name? Commodore Jesse Duncan Elliot didn't want any part of it. He was much older than Perry and much more battle-worn. And so you could see on the right, there's a ship that's kind of laying off, and that's his ship, the Niagara. And he disobeyed a direct order. He did not attack the ship he was supposed to, and he backed off of the fight. Well, in the meantime, Perry's ship with the purser on board is literally blown out of the water. And Perry abandons ship, and there's the Niagara, completely free of any kind of bullet holes, or the men are fine, everything's perfect. So he takes that ship, and very often you'll find that history sort of turns on a dime. It's kind of a weird phenomena. But in this particular case, there was a change in the wind, and that allowed Perry on the Niagara to sail right down the middle of the British line and blew them all out of the water. So the Battle of Lake Erie was the first time that an entire squadron of the British Royal Navy had been defeated. And it is today, the Great Lakes are the one area of demilitarized zone that still exists. And I will say that Jesse Duncan Elliot is the only Commodore in the U.S. Navy who has not ever had a ship named after him. Next slide. So Purser Samuel, during the fight, suffered a severe wound. The rigging, a cannonball hit the rigging, and it came down and it completely tore apart his back and his shoulder. And it wouldn't heal, so in the end, the surgeon, now this is before aseptic techniques or anything like that, went in to his shoulder and took out this piece of bone from his shoulder. You see it here, highly magnified. It really was only as big as a little straight pin. But it exists. It's at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum because he sent it home to his widowed mother at Barningham together with a letter describing how the injury happened. And back, even today, the memory of Purser Samuel Hambleton, who then actually lived quite a long life until about 1850, a replica of his signal flag is in Memorial Hall, where it hangs in memory of all of the Navy and Marines who have been lost at sea. When he came back, he bought a small piece of property, and this was originally called Perry Ham, a little cabin, which is where the inn at Perry Cabin now exists in St. Michael's. And he adored his friend Oliver Perry, and they were terribly, terribly close, thus Perry Ham. He lived there with his three of his other siblings, none of whom were married. Help. Lydia, who taught slaves and was herself a devout Methodist, and Aunt Louisa, and she is the one who was the letter writer, and she is the one who kept all of these letters that are now at the Historical Society there in Easton. And then the younger brother, Purser John Needles Hambleton, much, much younger, and he was with Oliver Perry when he died of malaria off the Orinoco River, and that in Venezuela, and that is when Perry Ham became known as Perry Cabin. They changed the name in memory of Perry. Well, anyway, as we approach the Civil War days, Frederick Douglass, a person known to all of you, was actually owned in the end by Thomas Auld and his wife, who was Rowena Hambleton. She was a niece of the Pursers. Actually, Rowena is buried right down here at Emerson Point in the graveyard there. Frederick Douglass actually based his whole abolitionist campaign on their cruelty, and they were cruel, make no mistake. Rowena was particularly stingy, wouldn't feed him, and he was sent to the famous slave breaker, whose last name was Covey, where they really did just horrendous things to the slaves. Douglass was not one to be fooled with, and he actually beat Covey up. at one point, and then Covey never laid another hand on it. But Douglass knew that he needed to be free, and he stole a canoe that belonged to Rowena's father, William Hambleton, right at Emerson Point, and he and some of his friends were going to sneak down to Chesapeake Bay, and they were going to get themselves free. But William Hambleton caught them. So they ate their pardons, sort of these papers that said that they were free blacks, so that the evidence wouldn't be found. And they made them walk barefooted all the way from beyond St. Michael's to the jail here in Easton. When Douglass was let out, William Hamilton said that if he saw Douglass, he would shoot him dead on the spot. So Thomas Auld did a good thing, and he sent Douglass to his brother Hugh at Fells Point, and then the rest of the story you know. He was then able to escape, and he based this entire abolitionist campaign on the cruelty of Rowena and Auld, Thomas Auld. The good news is that at the end of the Civil War, when Douglass came back here, he wanted to make amends to Thomas Auld. Rowena was dead by then, and Auld did say to him, "Look, if I had been you, I would have done the same thing." And so I think that that was a majestic thing to say, and I've often thought that if you can solve something at the moment that it's happening in that same time frame, you can bring a resolution to it, then it's so much better than letting it fester. So I'm happy for them, at least, that they had made peace with that. In the Civil War itself, there were 3 Hambletons, each in a different period of the war and different theater of the war. This is Jimmy Hambleton, who was raised in, do you remember the Bartlett Pear Tree Inn in Easton? Well, that was Purser Samuel Hambleton's nephew, also Samuel Jr., we'll call him, his home, and that is where Jimmy grew up. His father, Samuel Jr., was a rabid secessionist, and he was just out of his mind. He was so fervent about it. So Jimmy, dressed in black, blackened up, painted a canoe black, and they went down the Chesapeake, and he arrived in Virginia. He didn't fight at Antietam, but a lot of fighting in between until he got to Gettysburg. And he wrote home to his parents, and he said that if he were to, that he hoped he would live through the war, but were he to die, he wanted them to remember his good qualities, that he might forever live among the living. He did get to Gettysburg and was with the 1st Maryland Cavalry. Now at Gettysburg, he was behind the lines because the 1st Maryland really didn't fight. But as a former horsewoman, I became extremely interested in the horses and the fate of the horses and the mules. So there's much in the book about the treatment of the cavalry horses, the diseases and things of that nature. But there were about 1,900 horses and mules that were killed at Gettysburg alone. Isn't that just horrifying to me? It's just horrifying. In any event, then came the great Exodus, and this is where Brent, I got mixed up. No, there were 2, this is what it was, there were 2 retreat trains, and the Union hadn't figured out that the Confederates were retreating. One took all the injured through Cashtown and around South Mountain, and Jimmy, with the 1st Maryland Cavalry, a division of it, went with the other through Jack's Mountain to Monterey Pass. And it was a terrible thunderstorm. The Union hadn't caught on to this was a retreat. But anyway, off they went. And Jimmy was guarding the train that went through to Jack's Mountain. In any event, they get to the mountain and they see that there's this pass that the Union could get through. So Jimmy and 4 or 5 others in his unit were placed there with 1 cannon, 5 cannonballs, to hold off the whole Union cavalry, 4,500 men. And when the cavalry approached, because of the storm and the lightning strikes, there was all this booming and crashing and then 1 cannonball, and they thought that the whole of Jack's Mountain was really heavily fortified. So it did take a long time for them to break through. They finally caught on, and 5 hours later, they broke through and they captured a piece of the train, but the point was that the whole ordnance train by then was at Williamsport. Well, Jimmy was captured in all of this, and he was sent to Fort Delaware off of Delaware City in the Delaware River. If you've never been, it's a national park, and the guides are all dressed in period costume, and it's a marvelous experience to go there. In his day, it wasn't marvelous. People, 8 or 9 people a night would die. It's located on something called Pea Patch Island, which was originally just a little sandbar in the river. And a ship carrying peas ran aground, and the peas spilled and took root, and it created this little island. The trouble with the island is that at high tide, most of it is underwater. So they figured out a system where they put sluice gates and built ditches for all the excrement and stuff. And then at high tide, they'd lift these things and then hopefully flush out these ditches. But of course, it didn't work, and it contaminated the well water, so they were all really dying like flies. It was a mess. But he did live through it, and he went back to his unit in Virginia. Oops. How do I go back? One. Okay, the second member of the family who fought in the Civil War was U.S. Naval Surgeon Ninian Pinckney. He was actually married to a Hambleton. You see her on the right, Mary Sherwood. She was the aunt of Jimmy. Ninian always was in trouble. He was a little bit of a pothead, and he liked to mix his medicine and his politics. In any event, he was actually born in the Harwood house to a very prominent Maryland political family. He lived in the house at Londonderry, the retirement home here in Easton, that was built on his wife's property that she inherited from her father, also called Londonderry. He was there at Antietam inspecting the hospitals, which were just, you know, old, ugly, dirty barns, and then was sent out to the Mississippi River because, as Lincoln said, Vicksburg is the key, and they needed to bring down Vicksburg. So he was on the first naval hospital ship called the Red Rover, and he built the first hospital on the Mississippi River for Navy personnel, because only Army hospitals existed, and the Navy men were not treated very well. So he lived through the war and did a really very good job considering the day, and then became the head of the the Naval Academy in Annapolis. The third one was Edward Hambleton, and he's the one that I happen to be descended from. He was a blockade runner, and his grandfather, John Hambleton, in the 1790s, came from the Eastern Shore to Abington. They were all Methodists, and that was a big Methodist stronghold, and then later moved down to New Windsor in what is now Carroll County. He was also with the 1st Maryland Cavalry, but Jefferson Davis realized that this guy was brave as a lion. He would cross the Potomac with secret messages for the Confederacy. So he nabbed him to be a blockade runner. Now, in 1861, Lincoln had the Anacostia Plan, where they blockaded the whole eastern seaboard and ports down through Texas with federal ships. And that set up this thing called blockade running. And so the way the Confederacy was kept alive was that the cotton would be shipped to Bermuda, Nassau, or Havana, and deposited, and then the British and the French who needed the cotton would come in with arms and armament and clothing and some luxury goods and deposit that, and then they'd swap, and out would go the cotton abroad, and then in would come the arms for the Confederacy. It was a very complicated business, and it required a whole new ship being built, a new type or class of ship called the blockade runner. This was Hambleton's ship called the Dare, and she was built in on the Clyde River, Glasgow in Scotland. And what you see here is that they're very low profile, right? So that they really blend in with the waves, and they're painted gray. It's the first use of battleship gray. The smokestacks and the masts all collapsed, and the steam from for running the ships was sort of shot out underneath the boat so that the Federal ships wouldn't hear it. And they would slip in and out of, let's say, Wilmington, North Carolina, as an example. And usually at the dark of the moon or and at high tide, and had only a small peephole that they'd look through, and then a pilot would pick them up and take them up the Cape Fear River into Wilmington, North Carolina. It was a very, very dangerous sport. Most of them didn't make it. This one of Hambletons got caught, and so they did what the blockade runners did, which is they set her afire, and so that the Union then couldn't make use of the ship and turn it around and fight against them. So then, by about 1864, it was clear that that the Confederacy was falling, and so Arabella, his wife, and Ed decided to go back down from Richmond, where they lived, to Wilmington, North Carolina, and get out down the Cape Fear River under the guns of Fort Fisher and escape. And they were lucky because they did it just before Porter attacked Fort Fisher and seized Wilmington, North Carolina. In their escape, Arabella, and this portrait was probably done in France, Arabella was placed on the blockade runner. They made a pen of cotton around her so that if you know, she wouldn't be shot. And he said, poor Belle, she was wet to the skin, and her bonnet had fallen in her face, and she was shaking like an aspen tree. She was so cold. But she did survive. And shortly thereafter, her 10-year-old son, Frank, who we're going to meet later on, writes her a letter. And in fact, all of her letters were in his cake box because they went to Europe, where they stayed and toured. And he wrote her this little ditty that said, Savannah has fallen, Fort Fisher too. One of Daddy's sheep is dead, and how are you? So she was fine, and they were fine, and they had an awfully good time touring Europe until amnesty was granted to the Confederates. And then the older brother, John Hambleton, who had been running their dry goods store, told them that they better get back home, give up this business of the Confederacy, that the family had to move on. He was a remarkable man in that he had just made some money in West Virginia in coal and gas, and he had taken these profits and created a bank. But rather than keep it for himself, he kept it for the greater good of the family, and so that everybody would get dividends, if you will, in the family, because he felt that that was important for the family going forward. So they came back, Ed and Arabella did come back and joined the family bank, which is, why does this jump away? But when I press that, it moves. Okay. This was one of the more highly regarded banks around, did a very big business, and was trusted, had wires to New York and I don't know where all, but they were very connected and very highly regarded. This generation, I think we're now in about the 7th generation on the Western Shore, prospered. And Ed, the blockade runner, built this incredible house. It was stood on the hill of the corner of the, let's think, the northwest corner of Thornton Road and Seminary Avenue. And the banker's house was just down the ridge. They owned this whole ridge overlooking the Green Spring Valley. And Francis Henry, his younger brother, was a very gifted engineer, and he did the Canton Water Works. He did the underground sewer system in Baltimore that's now at last collapsing. He did about the electric cable cars. And one of the more interesting things that he did was the cigar ships.
Oh, cool.
This was the precursor to a submarine. And the idea was it was all bulletproof and smooth, so it could go underwater and do all these things and would transform naval warfare. The only thing was that it really could only get about that far under the water. It didn't really work very well, but the one that he sent off from France to England was decked out with beautiful rugs and chandeliers and all this kind of stuff. But they did, and in the end, of course, these didn't work, but he was that brilliant that this is what he did. So Frank Hambleton, the son of the blockade runner who wrote that funny ditty to his mother, takes over the family bank because Ed Hambleton dies in 1906. And Ed dies in 1906, and then 2 years later, Frank actually dies, leaving his wife, Anna Brooks, in really the matriarch of the Western Shore Hambletons. And she was known as a tough old bird, and she really did manage the family and the family finances very, very well. Her youngest son, his name was Johnny Hambleton, and he was the shining knight, if you will, of her 4 children. He fought in the First World War, was a pilot, and was highly decorated for it. Billy Mitchell, who was in charge of the Air Corps, said that he was one of the finest pilots he'd ever seen fly. Many secret missions, and this was a moment in time when air power became supreme. People didn't believe in airplanes. They certainly didn't believe in air fighting. But in that war, control of the battlefield from the air became significant. And the men in the trenches all said that if they knew Johnny Hambleton was flying over them, they knew that they would be just fine. He came home from the war with this incredible vision that planes were going to fly the oceans, planes were going to fly the polar route to Moscow, planes were going to fly to the moon. And of course they all thought he was absolutely batty. Well, in, let's think, 1927, he, Juan Tripp, and Marion Cooper, who was then working on King Kong, the famous movie, formed Pan American Airways. No sooner had they formed Pan American right at Hambleton than Hambleton itself burns down. And the only thing left were the marble walls. Johnny was able to save his mother, but also his pregnant wife, who you see there, Peggy, and their nephew, Donnie, a very small boy who later became a movie actor and playwright, watched the house burn from his mother's bedroom. Most of the furniture and the paintings were saved, so that was the good news. But the bad news is that house could never be rebuilt. Then comes the maiden voyage to Panama, from Miami to Panama to deliver airmail. Now this had never happened, and you see on the left Lindbergh, and Johnny Hambleton is on the right. Lindbergh had just come back from flying solo across the Atlantic in his Spirit of St. Louis. So the Pan American hired him to be their chief pilot, not only for the cachet of it, but also for safety reasons. People trusted Lindbergh, and so they knew that passenger flight was in the offing. But first came this airmail flight. Now Johnny Hambleton is the one who opened the entire air route, hopscotching across and then coming down Central America to Panama. But it was Lindbergh who flew the flight with Johnny as co-pilot, and they were deliberate. They wanted Lindbergh to get all the credit because that was really good PR. So they were on their way to opening up the Caribbean, and very soon was going to come opening up the Pacific in particular. But then this family tragedy hit again, and Johnny's plane crashed, and he was killed. It was a heavier plane than had normally been flown. Johnny was not the pilot. The pilot had never flown a heavy aircraft. This was a travel airplane that had a closed cabin that was new. So it was a much heavier, bulkier kind of a plane. And it came to land in Wilmington, North Carolina, and it stalled, and it just dropped out of the sky, and they were all killed. So standing next to the plane, the lady in the pretty shoes, that was Peggy. She was the first one there, and saw her husband dead. At her side, watching the plane come down, was her 2-year-old son, John Hambleton, and she was pregnant with George, who is still with us today. Then, Johnny's older brother, Eddie, we all call him Uncle Eddie. Uncle Eddie was abroad as well. He was ahead of he started the statistical department for the Army, and you can see he was highly decorated himself. He was extremely jealous of his younger brother, who was the flying hero and the one that everybody clapped and cheered about. He ran the Hambleton Bank. He was a real high roller. When Johnny died, he fell into a very serious depression and took out a bunch of loans on false financials and traveled all around the world, drinking and womanizing. And when he came back to the United States, the stock market had totally bottomed out, and he was called into the bank and faced with the false financials, and he'd left the bank something like $7 million in debt. And there was the proof of his bad behavior. So Eddie solved his problem, and he got into bed the night before Christmas Eve in 1930, he put a gun to his head and killed himself. It was not unusual for that to happen, and that's when the suicide clause was put into life insurance as a result of the suicides in the Depression. So Anna Brooks, the widow of Frank, is in a year and a half has had her house burned down and her 2 sons killed, dead, and she had another daughter, the daughter who ran off with the family chauffeur and eloped, and my grandmother. But she did really hold this family together, and she never gave up on Pan American, even though Johnny had been killed in service to Pan Am. In fact, by now, planes had flown the Pacific and were now about to fly the Atlantic. She rebuilt Hambleton. You can see on the left, that's old Hambleton Hall in England. She copied it stone for stone, wrought iron and all, and rebuilt it on the site of old Hambleton. And it's still there today. It's known as Selstead. It's where Charlie Knight, I think, lives. And the Yankee Clipper was now about to cross the Atlantic, and by goodness, this lady, she got in the Yankee Clipper. She flew all around Baltimore, and she died about a month later, knowing that one aspect of her son Johnny's dream had come true. The oceans had been conquered. So then we turn to World War II, and the gentleman that you see on the right of the screen was Ham Symington, and he would have been a nephew of Uncle Johnny. When you have somebody in the family like Johnny die tragically, the white light of the family, the kind of hero of the family, very often the men and others want to emulate him, sort of keep him alive by doing his thing. So Ham enlisted in the Army. He wanted to become a pilot. He was hopeless. His heart rate went through the roof. He got the shakes. I mean, his eyesight was terrible anyway. So he gave up the idea of flying and instead went into mechanics. And the family, both on his mother, Arabella Hamilton's side, and his father, Jack Symington's side, was a long history of engineering. He was, in fact, so good at it that he became part of a brand new division, which was called Air Crash Intelligence. And he was trained to go in and retrieve all the parts of downed German aircraft and send the parts and make lists of where things, what factories they were made in, and the date, so that they could monitor the output, the German output of their airplanes and their parts. But while he was there at Maxwell Air Force Base in Mobile, Alabama, he fell in love with this lovely gal and gave her a ring, the most beautiful ruby that had belonged to Anna Brooks, surrounded by diamonds. And Ham, unfortunately, was killed as they were moving into Brest, trying to get Brest released from the German hold. He was shot by German snipers and killed. But Frances later remarried. She never took that ring off, ever. And then in the 1960s, she went with a group from Atlanta to Europe. They wanted to bring a museum of fine art to Atlanta because there was a dearth of culture there. So she, together with all the intelligentsia, politicians, whatever, went on this flight to France. They had a wonderful time. They learned everything. And then they got on the Air France charter that took off, and on takeoff something happened and the plane blew up and everybody was killed. The ring survived the crash. So the ring came back to her second husband, who then gave it to Ham's younger brother, Donald, the little one who watched the fire. And he gave it to Samuel Kirkinson to be cleaned up. And when they told him to come and pick it up, he went in and they said, "Mr. Symington, we hate to tell you this, but the ring has been stolen and it's never been found." It's a sort of a side thing, but the tracing of jewels through history is really rather fascinating. And he said in the end he didn't want it, that he thought the ring was cursed. Then, of course, at the same time came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And you remember all the battleships were hit and sunk. But the aircraft carriers were all out off the base. And this was a great thing because this then became an air carrier war. It was airplanes fighting off of ships so far in the distance from the ships that they couldn't even be seen. So T, the one who wanted this book done, joined the Navy, and he was in air combat intelligence. He was on one of the smaller aircraft carriers that were built. It was a whole brand new Navy of these little carriers, and he survived the war quite miraculously, because one of the things that, of course, plagued them were the kamikazes. And here you see one of the kamikazes hitting the ship, but they were lucky because it didn't explode. So when I was interviewing T about his time in the war, and he really didn't want to talk about it much, he just said it was all a matter of how lucky you could be to survive. So these two photographs, iconic photographs of the surrender, you see on the left the American flag. It's backwards because it would, flying alongside the ship, as seen from the light aircraft carriers, that is the way it would look going into battle. The side against the bulkhead has actually been restored, and this is the flag that Matthew Perry took in, what was it, 1848-49 to Japan when they opened Japan to trade with the United States. It was presented to Ninian Pinckney, the Civil War surgeon, and it resides today at the Academy in the museum. On the right, about, I can't remember how many, it must have been 1,500 airplanes were launched from 50 ships or more and flew over the Missouri during the signing. And the Missouri was anchored in Tokyo Bay, exactly where Matthew Perry's ship had been when he opened it up to trade. T came home. His lovely wife, Carolyn Hoysdrat, was there with the 3 children to greet him. She didn't like Baltimore. She called it the quicksand of Baltimore. She found it stuffy. She was very liberal. And she encouraged T to go back into the movie business. And so they spent their time in New York and Baltimore, but T was eager to do that as well. There was a break that came his way. Oh, there. Joseph Losey, who was a prominent director out in California and Hollywood, and Bertolt Brecht, who'd been running from the Nazis, got together and were updating Brecht's play called Galileo. And Galileo, of course, was the scientist who said, sorry to the Catholic Church, the earth is not the center of the universe. And in the end, they made him recant. So they updated the play because now the atom bomb has been dropped, and the question is nuclear warfare going to benefit human life or destroy human life? Is this going to be fascism? People that have this power, are they going to be fascists? So they presented this to T, and T and Caroline absolutely leapt at it. It opened in Hollywood with Igor Stravinsky, Charlie Chaplin, Ingrid Bergman, Frank Lloyd Wright, all the higher-ups there to see it. And it opened in July of 47, I believe. T wanted to bring it to Broadway, and they had plans to do that. But 2 months after the opening, his wife Caroline, 8 months pregnant, contracted polio, and she was dead in 2 weeks.
Wow.
It was a terrible thing. Did not stop T for a moment, although he was obviously terribly torn apart by it. In October, now she died in September, in October, this group who were protesting HUAC, the House Un-American Activity Committee, because this is during the Red Scare and the red baiting and all that mess. The bottom step you see on the right, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall on his left. And then if you go up the right side, up to about the third person on the right is Danny Kaye and Gene Kelly. These actors came down and they absolutely refused to testify whether they were communists or not, because communism was not illegal and it was none of their business. Many of them then went to jail. Brent testified the next day, and he wanted out of America. He said he was a communist, and T organized lawyers, tickets, and limousine and got him out of America, and Losi also left. But by gum, on December 7th of that year, the 6th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, T opened Galileo on Broadway. He then went on to found the Phoenix Theater, and you can see a little phoenix coming out of his pipe, and opened the Broadway theater movement, reduced tickets, and hiring blacklist actors and playwrights. HUAC was on his tail the whole time, but he didn't care, and he persevered. He showed for the first time such actors as Meryl Streep, Carol Burnett, Glenn Close. He died at age 94, having eaten a Christmas meal at the Maryland Club of oysters and champagne. And the next day he died, and as his partner Nori Houghton said, as Chekhov said, oysters and champagne, that's not such a bad way to go. With the coming then of the Cold War, this is John Hambleton. He's the 2-year-old who saw his father's plane go down in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he fought in Korea, the first all-jet war, and the first war under the Department of the Air Force. And then he also fought in Vietnam. He flew over 200 missions in Vietnam. Highly decorated, a lot of secret missions, a lot of rescue missions. He came home. He was a test pilot for the Air Force, and he very much wanted to fly to the moon. He went into training for the Mercury capsule, but he was just a little too tall, so he didn't make it. But he, like his father, died when just a few years ago, when his plane stalled and it fell out of the sky. His brother George, who was only in the womb at the, when the father's plane went down, followed in his father's footsteps in that he didn't go to Princeton. He studied for the State Department. He spoke fluent Russian, studied Russian and Eastern European history. But he followed his father all through the Caribbean, all the bases that Pan American had opened. And then Juan Trippe came and said to George, "How's your Russian?" And George said, "Well, I could use some brushing up." He said, "Well, brush it up. You're headed to Moscow." So George, actually in 1968, opened the polar route from New York to Moscow. So that's the second part of his father's dream that was accomplished. And the third part came the next year when the men did, in fact, land on the moon. Many things that the Hambletons did had a tremendous philanthropic effect on the world. And for tonight, I've chosen Orbis, the flying eye hospital that George Hambleton, when he retired from Pan Am, took on. First it was a DC-8, then it was a DC-10, and it was completely refitted as an operating room. So they would go to these third world countries and park on a runway. They'd have to get all the landing rights and stuff that John Hambleton, the father, had done for Pan Am in the beginning. The plane would sit on the runway, the instruments were all there, potable water, vibration control, and then there was a hangar with a feed into the airplane so that other people could watch these operations and learn. This plane annually served 250,000 patients and trained over 1,000 doctors a year. One Arab newspaper said that this blessed aircraft shows the other face of America. And so there we are. I'm sorry for all the glitches with the machine, But I thank you all so much for coming, and I just hope you've enjoyed yourself despite the glitches.
Thank you for telling us about your family. We really appreciate that.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Come and see us at the library. We have lots of great programs coming up, and we have lots of books for you.